Nice to see everybody, and thank you so much to Professor Bartov for joining us today. It's really a pleasure and an honor to have you with us. For those who don't know, I'm sure he's the kind of person who needs no introduction, but I'm just going to say 2 words about him before we get to why we're really here, which is to learn from him about the uses and misuses of Holocaust memory. So Professor Bartov is Samuel Pisar Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Brown University, and he's a world-renowned expert in the history of genocide, in the field of genocide studies, in the history of anti-Semitism, the history of World War II, and he has also been studying and writing on Israel-Palestine. He has written an extraordinary number of books and won many, many awards. I'll just highlight some of his more recent work. In 2018, he wrote a book entitled Anatomy of a Genocide, The Life and Death of a Town Called, oh my gosh, I should have looked this up. Omar, can you save me from embarrassing myself? How do I pronounce the name of the town?
Buczacz.
Buczacz, thank you so much. Okay, so The Life and Death of a Town Called Buczacz, again, that came out in 2018. It won the National Jewish Book Award. He also, in 2022, came out with Tales from the Borderlands, Making and Unmaking the Galician Past, which I have yet to read, but I should because it concerns the history of part of my family. And Genocide, the Holocaust and Israel-Palestine, First-Person History in Times of Crisis, which came out in 2023. He's also writing a book right now, which is tentatively titled The Broken Promise, A Personal Political History of Israel and Palestine. And in addition to his academic work, Professor Bartov has also started writing fiction. And in 2023, he published a novel entitled The Butterfly and the X. So thank you so much for joining us. And we look forward to the talk, which again is entitled The Never Again Syndrome, Uses and Misuses of Holocaust Memory and the Weaponization of Language. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Thanks for coming to this talk. I would like to say, just by way of a preface to this, that I wrote an earlier version of this paper a few months ago, and as I was going over this yesterday and this morning, it occurred to me that unfortunately not much had changed. And the things that I was putting out, in fact, some of them had gotten worse, and you'll probably see that as we go along. So recently, and that's really the cause for this talk, the Holocaust has again become a common currency. 8 decades after the end of World War II, the memory of the extermination of the Jews by the Nazi regime and its collaborators is repeatedly invoked. Anti-Semitism, gradually delegitimized in public discourse in the wake of the final solution, seems to be on the rise. The well-meant, possibly sincere vows of never again, which became a staple of post-war pronouncements and ethics, seem now to have been brushed aside and forgotten, as violent rhetoric and actions against Jews have gained new adherents. So this is how many Jews around the world, as well as most Israelis, understand the present moment. This is the context in which it has become legitimate to speak about Hamas, not only as the equivalent of ISIS or Al-Qaeda, but also as Nazis. The context in which pro-Palestinian demonstrations are labeled anti-Semitic. The context in which Jewish and Israeli critics of occupation policies in the West Bank and the destruction of Gaza are called anti-Zionist, self-hating Jews and accused of being in the pay of Hamas. This is also the context in which a desire to turn the tables on those who repeatedly invoke the Holocaust to legitimize indiscriminate violence produces a counter-discourse of Zionism as a racist colonial ideology and of Israel as a Nazi-like genocidal state, an entity that must be wiped off the map. Extremist Jewish cause to establish a halachic, religious Jewish state from the Jordan to the sea, which is really a religious version of secular Zionism's goal of Jewish rule over all of historic, that is mandatory Palestine, are answered by demands from pro-Palestinian protesters to establish Palestine from the Jordan to the sea, echoing the extremist platform of Hamas, which seeks the creation of an Islamic state in that very same territory. In other words, allegations of genocidal intent by one side appear to legitimize genocidal intent by the other, in the name of liberation, self-determination, justice, and dignity. So in what follows, I will attempt to briefly discuss some fundamental questions regarding the use and abuse of the Holocaust as a historical event, a traumatic memory, and a warning to future generations. I will ask, was the Holocaust unique? And if so, what can we learn from it? Was the pledge to prevent genocide from happening ever again kept? And if not, why? Can the mass murder of the Jews serve as a guide to the nations of the world, and in what ways? And most importantly, perhaps, for the current moment, if the Holocaust was the clearest justification for the need to create a Jewish state, what role has it played in Israel's history for the last 7 decades? Finally, I would like to suggest how a better understanding of the misuse of the terminology of Holocaust, anti-Semitism, and genocide can help us not only perceive the current crisis in Israel and Gaza more clearly, but also to imagine and work toward a new path of reconciliation and justice for all. Now, before I begin, and since we're speaking about Holocaust memory, I'd like to say a few words on personal, familial, and collective trauma. The effects of traumatic events can travel from one generation to another, leaving deep scars on those who had not directly endured the original violence. It's therefore important to understand that past trauma can mold the perception of reality and modes of behavior of individuals and groups living under profoundly different political and social circumstances from those that existed at the time of the original traumatic events. Especially under conditions of shock and stress, individual and collective perceptions and modes of behavior may compulsively return to that original trauma, allowing it to anachronistically insert itself into the present and affect personal and group envisioning of the future. Consequently, the very response to catastrophe with such slogans as never again, the presumed healing effects of which are based on the avowal of catastrophe prevention, may end up with precisely the opposite result, namely a fixation on the very thing one wishes to prevent. That fixation can be paralyzing and debilitating, and at the same time can provide license and incentive to unrestrained violence. So let's now delve into the heart of the matter, starting with the question of Holocaust uniqueness. As a historical event, I would contend that by now, the scholarly consensus puts the Nazi mass murder of the Jews within the context of a series of modern genocides, starting perhaps as early as the extermination of the Herero and Nama population of German Southwest Africa, present-day Namibia, in 1904, which began incidentally with the slaughter of white German farmers, men and women, by African herders enraged by the theft of their grazing lands. Other contexts would include imperial and colonial violence, such as the 1915 genocide of the Armenians by the Ottoman Empire and the mass murder in Belgian King Leopold's Congo prior to World War I. Some scholars would argue that the Holocaust was an instance of population policies, starting with the Balkan Wars of 1912-1913, while others would associate it with genocidal totalitarian expansionist policies, as those implemented by Nazi Germany and Stalinist Soviet Russia in the so-called bloodlands of Eastern Europe. Finally, within Jewish historiography, the Holocaust has been contextualized as part or as the culmination of a long history of anti-Jewish violence, whose most immediate previous manifestation were the mass pogroms during the Russian Civil War of 1918-1921. Now, for historians, the claim of historical uniqueness is both a truism and a contradiction in terms. It's a truism because no historical event is precisely the same as the other. It's a contradiction in terms because no historical event occurs outside of the context and therefore cannot be understood other than by tracing its roots, comparing it to related events, and evaluating its relationship to other simultaneous developments. That, for instance, barring Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, the final solution would have been very different and might not have even happened at all. To put it differently, historical uniqueness implies extracting an event from history and propelling it into metaphysics, which is not an area in which historians, such as myself, feel at home. All this means that, by and large, most historians today would argue that while the Holocaust, like all other events in history, had unique features, such as the extermination camps, it was at the same time of a particular historical trajectory, or part of a particular historical trajectory, outside of which it cannot be understood. So what then is at stake in asserting the uniqueness of the Holocaust? As we can see when observing contemporary politics, the Holocaust has remained, at least rhetorically, unique to both Israel, and by extension, many Jews around the world, and to Germany. Now, this is not the place to closely analyze the stakes of insisting on the uniqueness of the Holocaust in Germany, although it is a very interesting phenomenon. So here I'll simply point out that the current German political and intellectual elites' justified pride in coming to terms with the Nazi past has had both a foreign and domestic policy price. As far as foreign policy is concerned, it has greatly limited Germany's ability to recognize and respond to present-day wrongs by other actors because of Germany's own past crimes. Thus, the German reluctance to help Ukraine defend itself against Russian aggression was justified by evoking the crimes of the Wehrmacht, the German armed forces, in the Soviet Union in World War II. That is, as the argument goes, how can Germany supply arms against the Russian army in view of the devastation caused by German-made arms, and soldiers, of course, 80 years ago? Ironically, this means that Germany is helping Putin's Russia implement the kind of expansionist imperial policies in Europe today that Germany implemented on the eve of World War II. But German attitudes toward Israel are far more telling and resonate much more passionately in the public sphere. Even before the events of October 7th, Germany insisted on being among Israel's staunchest defenders and found it almost impossible to voice any criticism of Israeli policies, to the extent that government-appointed so-called anti-Semitism czars accused Jewish and Israeli critics of Israel of being anti-Semitic. And I've had the privilege of being subjected to that. Germany's insistence on defending the memory of the Holocaust, or as former Chancellor Angela Merkel phrased it, its recognition that responsibility for the Holocaust was, quote, part of our national identity, and that Israel's security was Germany's raison d'etat, Staatsräson, as it's called in Germany, has also had domestic implications. According to figures issued by the German Federal Statistical Office in 2021, over 14 million people, or 17% of the population, had immigrated to Germany since 1950, and almost 5 million additional people, almost 6%, are direct descendants of parents who had both emigrated since 1950. This implies that a fifth of Germany's population traces itself back to an entirely different history, many coming from southeastern Europe, Turkey, and Syria, including 5 million Muslims. Yet part of Germany's policy of integrating newcomers into their new society is accepting the cardinal aspect of post-1945 German national identity, that is, responsibility for the Holocaust, which makes little sense for these migrants. Moreover, as some have argued, one result of Germany's pride in facing up to the Holocaust is the sense that it relieves the state of the need to tolerate its multiple new others. As Germany's face changes, and anyone going there can literally see that, its adherence to a national identity based on the Holocaust may therefore become a hindrance to social solidarity rather than an instrument for creating a post-Nazi nation. Now, in the case of Israel, as several scholars have shown, early public and educational attitudes toward the Holocaust tended to marginalize it as a shameful and embarrassing part of Jewish history and an obstacle to creating a new generation of proud and brave Jews in the Promised Land. And I personally was subjected to that kind of education in the 1960s, in particular, early 70s. Hence, the focus remained for long only on the ghetto fighters as the exception to the rule being those Jewish masses who allegedly went like sheep to the slaughter. Despite the impact of the Eichmann trial in the early 1960s, this attitude began to change only in the 1980s, not least in response to the War of 1973 and the rise of Menachem Begin's right-wing Likud party to power, both events which I experienced as a soldier and as a student later at Tel Aviv University. The new approach, which has since become dominant, has made identification and association with the Holocaust into a mechanism of integration and social solidarity between the secular and the religious, the Ashkenazi and the Mizrahi communities, that's the Jews coming from the Middle East and North Africa, the old and the young. This re-centralization of the Holocaust as the cardinal moment of modern Jewish history has had the effect of both insisting on its singularity and of interpreting it not as a past event, but rather as a clear and present danger of isolation and destruction. From this perspective, the Holocaust is seen as, in Israel, not only as an event that made the creation of the state an undeniable and urgent necessity, but also as making Israel itself into a unique entity that operates according to its own rules and logic. In other words, the Holocaust liberates Israel from the constraints of all other nations, not least because they, as the saying goes, stood by while the Jews were slaughtered. At the same time, the centrality of the Holocaust in Israeli education and in political and public life makes national solidarity into one based on fear and trepidation, rather than on personal security and improvement of individual and collective life. Hence the ease with which Israeli society can switch between an obsession with traveling to other countries as liberation from the constraints of a small and threatened country, to a phobia that the whole world is against us, dictating that we rely only on ourselves. Between the insistence on Israeli society as being open-minded and tolerant to a view of Palestinians and other Arabs, but also increasingly of domestic political and social opponents as worthy of utter destruction, and between the assertion that the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, is the most moral army in the world, to a view of the military as the remorseless tool of destruction, with a license to do all that it takes to wipe out the enemy. And so Holocaust uniqueness has a price, quite apart from being historically at best inaccurate. This brings us to the ubiquitous pledge that went up everywhere in Europe after the end of the war: never again. The meaning of this pledge depends, of course, on what we're talking about. If it means never again the Holocaust, then this was not a difficult pledge to keep, since the Holocaust as a historical event, though certainly not as a personal and collective trauma, was over by then. And since history does not in fact repeat itself, there was no danger of that particular Holocaust ever happening again. But obviously there were other ways of interpreting the pledge. If, as many Jews, and certainly as the state of Israel understood it, the pledge meant never again another genocide of the Jews, then we can also say that it was kept, just as the fear that it might happen, as I noted, had various political repercussions. Indeed, the founding of the State of Israel was supposed to serve as the best insurance policy against a Jewish genocide ever happening again. That was one reason why, so soon after the Holocaust, the international community largely supported its creation. Ironically, as many have pointed out, Israel turned out to be the least safe place for Jews since 1945, as well as the one most focused on another Holocaust happening to it, a focus that has become a motive and a tool of policy, as well as an instrument for shaping its citizens' minds. However, if the pledge meant, as many others believed, including some prominent voices among the survivors, never again genocide, a mass murder of a particular population because of the identity ascribed to it by the perpetrators, then of course this pledge proves to be worthless. We have seen numerous genocides and other crimes against humanity since 1945, and for decades the pledge was never even invoked. Interestingly, it was this pledge, the pledge to never again carry out genocide, that was in fact inscribed in law. In 1948, the United Nations passed the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, which came into force after a sufficient number of nations signed it in 1951. But the resolution was not invoked for decades thereafter, not least because its adjudication and enforcement depend on an international consensus that was prevented by the division of the world into two opposing camps during the Cold War. Only after the collapse of the Soviet Union, which was supposed to have heralded the end of history, as you may recall, and the two major genocides that followed swiftly thereafter, did the Genocide Convention make its first appearance. The International Criminal Tribunals for the former Yugoslavia, the ICTY, and for Rwanda, the ICTR, which deliberated the mass crimes committed in those countries in the 1990s, followed in the wake of the legal framework already created in 1945 by the International Military Tribunal in Nuremberg, the Genocide Convention of 1948, and the Geneva Conventions of 1949 and subsequent protocols. The International Court of Justice, the ICJ, founded in 1945 as part of the United Nations structure, whose role is to adjudicate disputes between states, as well as to legally advise the UN, similarly took a long time before it turned to the all-important issue of genocide. It was only in 2019 that it began proceedings against Myanmar on the alleged genocide of the Rohingya, as requested by the Gambia. In 2022, it issued provisional measures against Russia, following a filing by Ukraine. And in 2024, it issued provisional measures concerning Israel's war in Gaza, as requested by South Africa. Finally, there is the International Criminal Court, the ICC, whose establishment was recommended in the 1948 Genocide Convention. It's written right into the convention. The ICC was finally created only in 2002, based on the 1998 Rome Statute, a statute against which Israel voted because the statute defines, quote, the actions of transferring population into occupied territory as a war crime. Currently, 4 signatory states, Israel, the United States, Sudan, and Russia, have given notice that they no longer intend to become states parties, and thus have no legal obligations arising from their signature of the statute, the Rome Statute. This, however, does not liberate individuals in these countries, as UN members, from being charged with the crimes listed on the statute, which include genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes of aggression, if their own domestic courts are unable or unwilling to take legal action against them. And as you probably know, the prosecutor of the ICC has asked for arrest warrants for the Israeli Prime Minister and the Israeli Minister of Defense. The ICC has not yet decided that. So what does all this tell us about that famous Never Again pledge? The international record is poor, but not meaningless. An entire edifice of international humanitarian law was created in the aftermath of World War II, which has since been greatly expanded and interpreted through international negotiations and case law. As is the nature of international law, its enforcement is the function of political circumstances, as well, of course, of the respective power of the states involved. Nonetheless, this edifice has become a major player in the affairs between states, and has set certain limits to their conduct toward other states, and to a lesser extent toward their own populations. Although the origins of this system date back to the 19th century, much of the impetus for its vast expansion must be traced back to the mass crimes of World War II, and most especially to the Holocaust. In retrospect, this was a blessing and a curse. Even if we accept that the Never Again pledge referred to future genocides rather than to the specific case of the Holocaust, the particular nature of the final solution created such an extreme and singular image of genocide that future genocidal events could be said to not entirely match it. In other words, the Holocaust triggered the Genocide Convention, but also set a very high bar to identifying genocide as only an event of similar range and bureaucratic efficiency. This also created a gap between how genocide is defined in the Convention, which leaves much greater room for interpretation, and the legal, political, and popular imaginary of genocide having to resemble the Holocaust in order to merit that title. This then raises the question of whether the mass murder of the Jews serves as a guide to the nations of the world, and if so, in what ways. It can be said that over time, and especially since the 1990s, the Holocaust came to symbolize the epitome of evil in much of the world. This was a long and uneven process, but it culminated, for instance, in the 2005 United Nations resolution on the 60th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, designating January 27th as International Holocaust Remembrance Day. So it took all those years to designate that day. Similarly, in 1995, the European Parliament adopted resolutions drawing attention to the obligation to remember the genocide of the Jews, both through commemorations and by means of education. Somewhat more problematically, as I will note in a moment, in November 2018, the EU became a permanent international partner of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, known as IHRA. To be sure, the belated recognition of the Holocaust as an important event in the middle of the 20th century must be seen within multiple historical and political contexts. For instance, East European countries seeking to join the EU following the collapse of their communist regimes had to accept the commemoration of the Holocaust. This meant exposing dark episodes in their own pasts, just as they were in the process of asserting their national identity after decades of communist defamation of their newly discovered national heroes and obfuscation about collaboration in the Holocaust. The result was what has been called a competition of victimhood, or rhetoric about the so-called double genocide, one by the Nazis of the Jews and one of, so to speak, our own people by the communists, often identified as Jewish or supported by the Jews. The growing focus on the victimhood of the Jews has had all kinds of unexpected deleterious consequences. I've already alluded to the case of Germany in terms of its effect on integrating immigrant populations. But another effect has been a growing impatience among young generations of non-immigrant Germans, with a constant harping on the duty to remember, which brings with it also attributions of generational guilt, or at least responsibility. The rise of anti-Semitism in the German right, and the rise now, of course, of the extreme German right, of the AfD, which has, of course, also other socioeconomic causes, cannot be entirely divorced from the sense among younger German cohorts of imposed guilt. The tendency in Germany, France, and Britain, as well as the United States, to associate anti-Semitism with immigrants, especially from Arab and Muslim countries, often misses the mark by dismissing the deeper, local root of an anti-Jewish sentiment. This sentiment has a complex relationship with the expansion of Holocaust commemoration and education, related to the visible presence of well-integrated Jews within political, economic, and educational elites in those countries. It is also related to the role Israel plays in the life of the Jewish diaspora. The policies of these major Western powers toward Israel and the impact of Israeli occupation policies on Muslim, Arab, and liberal constituencies, especially among the young. Here, the tension between the proliferation of Holocaust remembrance throughout the West on the one hand, and the proliferation of images of Israeli oppression of Palestinians on the other, has been most palpable and has reached a moment of crisis since the Hamas massacre of October 7th and the subsequent destructive Israeli assault on Gaza. So can the mass murder of the Jews serve as a guide in this instance? The answer to this depends on the beholder. Most Israelis perceive the war in Gaza as a just response to and an attempt to prevent another instance of the massacre of 1,000 Israeli civilians, not all of them Jews. Since the Hamas massacre is constantly portrayed as genocidal, and Hamas is described in the Israeli media as a Nazi organization, the obvious conclusion is that the war in Gaza must be guided by the lessons learned from the Holocaust, and thus be implemented as a robust but unavoidable measure to prevent the repetition of another Jewish genocide. Conversely, most supporters of the Palestinians and other critics of Israeli policies see what they describe as a brutal and indiscriminate destruction of lives and property in Gaza as genocidal, a position that I've also adopted since the Israeli incursion into Rafah on May 8, 2024. Such critics thus turn to the core lesson of the Holocaust, the 1948 Genocide Convention, to argue for an immediate halt to the Israeli assault and an obligation of the international community pledged to prevent, stop, and punish the crime of genocide. To say that one lesson of the Holocaust is to bring Israel before the ICJ on charges of genocide appears to many as appalling and is generally portrayed in Israel as a cynical action motivated by anti-Semitism. Conversely, others, including myself, argue that silence and inaction by the international community will expose the impotence of the very edifice of international humanitarian law that was put into place in the wake of the Holocaust. This conundrum leads me to the following question. If the Holocaust was the clearest justification for the need to create a Jewish state, what role has it played in Israel's history for the last 7 decades? For most Jews around the world, the establishment of a Jewish state as a haven for the remains of world Jewry seemed the only logical conclusion of the Holocaust. But what appeared as an act of supreme justice became entangled in an act of injustice from its very inception. Because the injustice of the expulsion of 750,000 Palestinians from what became the State of Israel and of the refusal to let them return came so soon after the Holocaust, and because that displacement of most of the Arab inhabitants of Palestine was carried out by Jews only recently displaced from Europe, these two events, the Shoah and the Nakba, became inextricably entangled. And yet, the respective victims of these events, precisely because they perceive their own catastrophe as constitutive of their individual and collective identity, have insistently rejected the stark reality of this entanglement. Since that time, the Holocaust has played an increasing role in Israeli self-perception and political rhetoric. Ironically, just as the numbers of those who survived the Nazi hell have progressively diminished, the importance of the Shoah in Israeli public life has grown. By now, the conflict with the Palestinians, or rather the various forms of rule by 7 million Jews over 7 million Palestinians, can only be seen through the distorting lens of a historical event that has little connection to the reality of occupation and oppression. And yet the Holocaust continues to play a major role both in excusing the occupation and as an essential bulwark against another Holocaust. And, as was the reality in Israel for several decades until October 7th, in keeping the occupation hidden from sight behind the complex of separation walls, fences, and bypass roads. In this manner, undemocratic and oppressive rule over the other half of the population was repressed as unrelated to progressive, wealthy, Western-oriented Jewish Israel. Eventually, the clarifying catastrophe of the Holocaust became, for most Israelis, a vast and ugly fig leaf, whose combined effect was a lamentable combination of self-victimization and self-pity with self-righteousness, hubris, and euphoria of power, whereby one side of the equation justified the other. Ethical concerns and moral qualms were brushed aside as either marginal or distracting in the face of the ultimate cataclysm that is the genocide of the Jews. what had been for long the never again syndrome thus became its exact opposite, the again and again syndrome, an internalized, irrational, and misleading terror of another Holocaust, always lurking behind the corner, from which one can liberate oneself only by lashing out, pressing down, breaking in, and blowing up both one's own doubts and unease and any real or perceived external threat. This is not a mental condition or a historical understanding conducive to tolerance, understanding, moderation, or reconciliation. To be sure, there were always other forces in Israeli society that worked against this so-called Holocaustism or Shoatiyut, arguing that the growing prevalence of Holocaust paranoia and fears of universal anti-Semitism were bringing about precisely what they sought to forestall, namely growing resistance from the occupied and growing disenchantment with Israel by its greatest foreign supporters. But even those more liberal forces in Israel never entirely liberated themselves from that constitutive Holocaust mentality, as can be seen these days with what has been called the sobering up, hitpakhut, of the Israeli left. Thus, we repeatedly hear about the left's realization that, contrary to its hopes, it has turned out that the Palestinians really do want to perpetrate another Holocaust on Israel. Consequently, Israelis have no choice but to do all it takes to protect themselves, no matter what the rest of the world says. This mentality has been cultivated by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his successive governments now for decades. This didn't start, of course, on October 7th. It was under his guidance that the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IHRA, definition of anti-Semitism was pushed by Israeli representatives around the world, making criticism of Israeli policies tantamount to anti-Semitism. The aggressively critical response we hear today in Germany, France, Britain, and the United States, of course, to those calling to put an end not only to the slaughter in Gaza, but also to the entire apparatus of occupation, testify to the success of Netanyahu's rhetoric, which presents resistance to occupation and oppression as genocidal, and illegal settlement as a just Jewish response to past and future Holocausts. The abuse of terminology has therefore become a tool of policy and an instrument of obfuscation and propaganda. And there's a whole side to it in the United States that maybe we can talk about later. It is for this reason that we, as scholars or as citizens or students dedicated to truth, justice, and transparency, must insist on what we mean when we use such terms and expose those who intentionally or out of ignorance misuse them. Indeed, only by clarifying our terms can we begin moving toward resolving the crisis and opening a path for political reconciliation and justice for all. Yet this is far more difficult than one might think, and I'll cite just one example. On February 14th, 2024, the notoriously liberal Van Leer Institute in Jerusalem hosted a symposium titled The Hague, Gaza, Us, and the World. The keynote speech was delivered by an Israeli, Professor Eyal Benvenisti, who is the Wellwell Professor of International Law in Cambridge University and Director of the Lauterpacht Center for International Law. Some of you may know that Hersch Lauterpacht had defined the term crimes against humanity as the extermination of civilian populations as individual human beings. At around the same time, Raphael Lemkin, who came from a similar East European Jewish background and studied, like Lauterpacht, at Lemberg University, had coined the term genocide as the intent to destroy ethnic, national, or religious groups as such. That's the big difference between individuals and groups. The discussion at the Van Leer Institute focused on the implications of South Africa's referral of Israel to the ICJ on suspicion of perpetrating genocide. Now, interestingly, despite his scholarly credentials, Benveniste made rather loose use of the terms genocide and anti-Semitism. As he put it, South Africa's action was not motivated by a desire to stop the war, but rather intended, quote, to exploit the international stage in order to deny the legitimacy of the Jewish state and to undermine the deep connection between the existence of the state as resurrection following the attempted extermination of its people, attempt to exterminate its people, end of quote. For that reason, he agreed with the Israeli Defense Team's description of South Africa's filing as, quote, a blood libel, thereby linking it directly to the deepest wells of European anti-Semitism. Indeed, Benveniste stated unambiguously that, quote, the criticism against us is partly driven by anti-Semitic motivation, end of quote. Conversely, in Benveniste's view, the, quote, terrible massacre, the genocide carried out by Hamas on the Black Sabbath, that's the name given in Israel to October 7th, or one of the names, and the crimes it committed, indeed fit the definition of genocide. Asked about the statement in the discussion, Benveniste reiterated that to his mind, quote, people had been killed and slaughtered in a terrible manner because they were members of a group, and only for that reason. This is the definition of genocide according to the convention. End of quote. Now, I cite Benveniste's statements because they demonstrate that even among experts of the very terms in question, other factors tend to intervene when discussing issues close to their own worldview and sentiments. Benveniste provided no proof whatsoever that either South Africa or the ICJ were motivated by anti-Semitism, but simply asserted the fact, to the general agreement of his almost exclusively Jewish Israeli audience. To those present, apart from the Palestinian professor of law, Raif Zrek, who raised some questions about these assertions, this was obvious. Similarly, Benveniste's assertion that the Hamas attack was genocidal was stated without any perceived need for proof. The fact, for instance, that Hamas militants also massacred Bedouin and foreign Asian workers who clearly pointed out to them that they were not Jews was not considered. Nor did Benveniste entertain the possibility of categorizing the Hamas attack as a war crime or a crime against humanity rather than genocide. Simultaneously, he insisted that even the suspicion that Israel's actions in Gaza might be criminal was clearly anti-Semitic. Now, since that speech, the death toll has risen from 30,000 at the time to an estimated 42,000 people, the majority of them civilians, of whom half are children, with close to 100,000 wounded, untold thousands buried under the ruins of demolished buildings, thousands more needing medical care, dying as indirect victims of the systematic destructions of hospitals, and an unprecedented humanitarian disaster in which the vast majority of the population has been repeatedly displaced, suffering acute shortages of food, clean water, sanitation, medical supplies, and shelter. By now, there can be no doubt that Israel is engaging in a deliberate policy of obliteration of medical facilities, universities, schools, mosques, cultural and political sites, housing, and infrastructure, with the intent of making Gaza uninhabitable for its Palestinian population by eliminating any option of sustaining culture and education, indeed of preserving the population's bare life. Now, I could also cite many statements around the world accusing Israel of genocide even before the IDF operation in Gaza began, indicating both an expectation of mass violence, which was not unwarranted, and in some cases an understanding of Israeli policies against Palestinians as a priori genocidal. There's also no need here to retrace the multiple and utterly groundless allegations of anti-Semitism against university presidents and professors, the vicious attacks against both Muslims and Jews on campuses and elsewhere, and especially the deafening silence by so many mainstream and knowledgeable experts and public figures who, for fear of being labeled one way or another, are leaving the field open to the extremists and thereby contributing to the polarization they oppose. As I see it, what we need right now is clarity and purpose. Terminology should be applied precisely as a tool to understanding and defining events, rather than as an instrument of politics. The purpose of such clarity must be finding a way out of the chaos. This is not the place to outline in detail what I have in mind, but several issues must be stated outright. First, that violence cannot resolve the conflict. Second, the notion that Israel can manage the Palestinian issue by shoving it under the rug can no longer be entertained. The 14 million people living between the river and the sea must be offered a way to coexist in peace, justice, and dignity. Third, the political leaders of both sides and their policies have been deeply discredited and must be replaced. Fourth, only massive international intervention and commitment, especially but not exclusively by the United States, can begin pushing the sides toward changing the political paradigm of the last few decades and seeking reconciliation. Providing a political horizon of sharing the land will also change the current reality. Finally, if we are to take seriously that post-war slogan of never again, this is the moment to do so. It is already too late for tens of thousands of innocents. It is time to pull back from the abyss and do all in our powers as scholars, as students, and citizens to convince our governments to compel the warring sides to stop the killing and bring peace to their peoples. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We do have one question, Omer, in chat. Pete writes, in November last year, you wrote in the New York Times that as a historian of genocide, you didn't believe there was proof that a genocide was taking place in Gaza. Since then, however, you have written that you no longer believe that to be the case and that, quote, Israel has engaged in systematic war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocidal actions, end quote. Could you please talk about what made you change your mind? Was there a piece of evidence or a moment that was a tipping point, quote unquote, in your mind? And what has been your personal experiences of engaging in this debate over the last year?
Right. Yeah, I could give another lecture on this. So as I mentioned briefly in this talk, and as I also wrote in a long essay in The Guardian in August, my tipping point was May 8th. 2024, when the Israeli army, against pressure by the U.S., went into Rafah. The U.S. was saying, don't go there, there are a million civilians there, and you're going to kill a lot of civilians. And the IDF said, no, don't worry, we can move them elsewhere. And they did. They moved them, most of them, to Al-Mawasi, to a tent city on the beach where those people still are, where there's no ability to live anything resembles a normal, healthy life. And then they went in. And so for me, because this was the last area in Gaza that the IDF had not moved into, apart from some isolated other places that we can talk about in northern Gaza. So for me, this showed something that I then read back into everything that had happened until then, and that is still continuing today, actually accelerating right now as we speak. And that is that the kind of statements that I already cited in my article in November in the New York Times, which were genocidal statements, and were incitement to genocide, which itself is actually a crime, by people with executive authority, not just by anybody, were not simply done, in rage, when the blood was boiling, as they said in Israel, but actually indicated something much more than that they indicated a particular intent to make Gaza completely uninhabitable to its population and to destroy everything that would make it possible for that population to maintain itself as a group. So it's not only, of course, first of all, it's the killing of large numbers of people, which was not only because of carelessness, but was done systematically, but it's also the systematic destruction of everything that makes makes it possible for a group to live as a group. And that's the main issue of genocide. Are you trying to destroy that group in whole or in part? And that's a destruction of universities, including large numbers of faculty, destruction of schools, of mosques, of hospitals, of museums, of public buildings, systematically, and then moving the population over and over again, of course, under the heading that it's for their own safety, but the moment they are moved from those places are blown up. They cannot go back to them anymore, and debilitating the population in the process. If you combine all of these factors together, what appears to be is a systematic attempt to make it impossible for that part of the Palestinian people living in Gaza, about 70 to 80% of whom are refugees from 1948 and their descendants, to continue living there. And what may happen with them is anybody's guess right now, and the long-term effects of the conditions under which they live, even those who have not been mutilated and have not been killed, and have not died indirectly from all of this, the long-term effects will be huge. But the general intent appears to me to make it uninhabitable. And I want to add one last thing, because in the last few days, the Israeli army has moved into Jabalia, or has rather besieged the refugee camp of Jabalia, where there are about 250,000 Palestinians. That's in northern Gaza. That's north of the Netzarim corridor, which has now been widened and separates northern Gaza, which is about a third of the strip, from the rest of it. Now, the Israelis claim that they had some knowledge of a reorganization of Hamas there. Clearly, what they're doing is in accordance with the plan that has been sort of sold on the Israeli media now for months by General, retired General Giora Highland, which is now known as the General's Plan, several generals, right, in plural plan, which is to squeeze the civilian population out of northern Gaza, up to 400,000 there, and do it first by persuading them to leave, and then by imposing a total blockade. No food and no water. And no food and no water is coming in right now. I just heard this morning that the U.S., obviously under its own pressures, has said that if the IDF does not provide food and water, the U.S. will stop providing arms to Israel. We are yet to wait whether this will happen. In the past, these were empty threats, and the U.S. has made many empty threats since October 7th. But the plan is to empty that area completely. There are already well-built army camps there, 2 large camps in that area, and there are settlers waiting just around the corner to move in. And that seems to be part of a plan, whether they'll succeed in doing it or not only of the extremists to the right of Netanyahu, but Netanyahu himself, who is hiding under the mantle of being pushed by the extremists to gradually annex larger and larger parts of Gaza and remove the population into smaller and smaller areas where they just will not be able to live anymore.
Thank you for that. Amanda has also written a question in chat. My question, how do you see Holocaust memory being used and or misused by the pro-Palestine movement in the US and around the world? She's thinking especially about our encampment movements here in the US and the ways slogans like never again for anyone, quote unquote, have become part of Jewish movements for ceasefire.
Okay, so never again for everyone, or some version of that, is something that I've written myself. That is that never again was never meant and should never have been meant only never again for Jews. Never again was supposed to be a universal statement saying never again genocide. And people like Primo Levi were big supporters of that idea and became increasingly depressed in their later years. And his name escaped me now. Became increasingly depressed by the fact that there was so much war going on after 1945. So many massacres of population that slogan "never again" was just a slogan, and nobody paid attention to it. Saying "never again" is for everyone, I think, is a good thing and a laudable thing. But it is true that there is rhetoric used both on pro-Israel sides, whatever that means, and pro-Palestinian sides, whatever it means, because there are various groups with various ideas, where there's abuse of terminology. And it's a long time, it's been going on for decades and decades. I mean, I remember being a student at Oxford in the 1980s and being told that the Jews were doing to the Palestinians what the Nazis did to the Jews. This kind of false equivalence people tend to use that, just as they're saying now that Hamas are Nazis, and while Hamas are pretty despicable what they did, and they should hopefully one day be put on trial, and they committed war crimes and crimes against humanity, they're not Nazis. They're something else, but not Nazis. So this kind of false equivalence is not helping anyone. So we should distinguish between two things. One is abuse of terminology, and the second is that we I think, as citizens of this world, and certainly people who study this phenomenon, we can also learn from the past, and we can say there are policies, there are actions, and there is rhetoric that is objectionable, and there are ways of analyzing what is happening through what we know about the past. And here is, again, the question of genocide. There is a tendency to say, if you don't have, or two ways of thinking about it. One is, if you don't have extermination camps, then it can't be genocide, which is nonsense, because the Genocide Convention certainly doesn't call for extermination camps. It calls for the attempt to destroy a group as such. So that's on the one side. And on the other side, to identify any action that you find objectionable, massacres, war crimes, immediately as genocide. And as people were saying to me, how many Palestinians need to die before you call it genocide? And the fact of the matter is that there is a particular definition. And it doesn't mean that genocide is worse or better than crimes against humanity. It's just a different thing. And my own decision on finally using that term was when it became clear to me that this was indeed an intentional policy to destroy the existence of Palestinians as a group in Gaza as such. So if you reach that conclusion, you can use that term, but the sort of loose use of this terminology, I think, only obscures things rather than helping.
Thank you so much for that. We do have an open floor for questions, so please don't be shy. You can either raise your hand or type your question into the chat. In the meantime, I'll just ask a simple question. Omer, in your closing, you mentioned massive international intervention. You specifically referred to the U.S. and then made some remarks about what that intervention could look like. But I would like to know from you, what more are you thinking about, and what, in your view, has prevented such international intervention from transpiring so far?
Yeah, it's so difficult. First of all, I would say that, as far as I can tell right now, no change can be expected from within. I don't see that happening from Israel. And the demonstrations in Israel against Netanyahu, and people feel that if they could only get rid of Netanyahu, then things will change. I don't see any alternative leadership in Israel. The people who might replace him, not that he's going anywhere, but let's say he left, don't appear to be speaking about any other kind of policy, including the head now of the reformed Labour Party. So you have to go to the Arab parties, the Israeli Arab parties, to find any kind of thinking outside of this box. So the thinking about changing the entire paradigm, that is thinking about the war politically and not militarily, is just not happening in Israel. There was just no the leadership. And among Palestinians, there may be some Palestinians who could be an alternative leadership, but they happen to be in Israeli jails. And Israel is not about to release them. Now, regarding the US, so if Israel cannot bring it from the inside, and if Israel is leading the entire region into the abyss, which it is, despite the fact that Arab countries don't want conflict with Israel, none of the Arab countries, none of the Sunni Arab countries want conflict with Israel, and they keep saying it. But Israel is pushing in that direction. Then the United States is the most important player, and it's the most important player. First of all, in the most simple sense, that President Biden could have in November or December last year said to Netanyahu, ceasefire within 2 weeks. I don't care how you do it, but if you don't do it, you are on your own. And the IDF would stop being able to operate within 2 to 3 weeks. That's it. The IDF is completely dependent on massive daily supplies from the United States. People don't talk a lot about that. It would not be able to operate. It's operating because of the Americans and the Germans, of course, who also provide between 20 and 30%. All the rest is from America. Germany has started, there are many reports that German supplies have slowed down. So in that sense, the US could have first of all stopped this process, but it didn't do it. Why did it not do it? I think, first of all, it was a major mistake. That's sort of within American domestic policies. I think it was a major mistake by the Biden administration. There would have been a high domestic price to such a decision, but there would have been long-term benefits. And because he was unwilling to pay the price is now. The price is that those people who would have supported the administration had it succeeded in stopping the massacre are now those who are, of course, opposing, or at least will not support this administration and potentially the next one. What are these pressures? Look, I mean, there are various elements. I want to say first that what is happening in the Middle East right now is completely contrary not only to American national interests, but also to Israeli national interests. That the people who are leading Israel now are leading it against its own national interests, quite apart from the massacre of Palestinians and now killing also thousands of Lebanese civilians as well. But that has to be recognized, that it's completely contrary to the national interests of both countries. I think that the administration is acting this way. Partly it was personal in terms of Biden himself, some kind of emotional attachment to Israel, not to Netanyahu for sure, but to Israel, some commitment, his sense of his Zionism. And you can identify such sentiments going all the way back to the Balfour Declaration. There's a kind of sense of Christian Zionism. But I think most of it is not that. I think most of it is major pressures on the administration, on the Democratic Party, the same pressures that we've seen on American universities. And they're coming mostly from money, from donors. They're coming from people who are major supporters, financial supporters of the Democratic Party and of liberal universities such as those that we teach in, who claim to be representatives also of the Jewish population of the United States, which they are not, who claim to be worried about anti-Semitism, and who happen to be, many of them, Jewish billionaires. There's also Israel has become, over decades, deeply entrenched within a whole set of American interests that have to do not just with money, also with money, of course, but with arms manufacturing, with technology. And so the price of going against all of this is very high, because you may find yourself facing very substantial odds. I'm afraid that, to my mind, I have to say, in the long run, and that has to do also with all this flaunting of fighting anti-Semitism, of shutting down speech on campuses with the argument that it's anti-Semitic, which it isn't. I think the long-term effects of that would actually be a rise in real anti-Semitism in America, whose roots are not on the left and have never been on the left. Not in America, not in Europe. That's a myth. That's a sort of Judeo-Bolshevik myth. The roots of anti-Semitism have always been on the right, not on the left. And this kind of flaunting right now of so-called Jewish power, this is not Jews, of course, it's particular individuals who don't represent their community at all, but they're being drunk on their power, is going to eventually bring about a real backlash. Because if the United States gets involved again in the Middle East in a way that it doesn't want to, people are going to pay a price. There'll be a price in capital, there'll be a price in blood, as there was in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And that, from those extreme right-wing elements in the United States, will be seen as a result of Jewish interests pushing to support Israel. And so this is what troubles me deeply about what is happening in the United States today. And it could be, and perhaps can still be, prevented, although it's very late now, by the US asserting its power over Israel.
We have two questions further in chat. One from Fotani. Fotani, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing your name. They ask, in a related question, I would like to know your view on boycotts, divestments, and sanctions, and whether or not that could be part of an intervention. And then the second question, since we're running short on time and our audience is only now warming up, which is typical. But thank you, everybody. Are there any parallels with the Russian justification of the invasion to Ukraine, the use memory of World War II, for example? So two separate questions.
Yeah, so the second one is easy because, yes, and Russia claimed to have invaded Ukraine to stop genocide. Of course, a genocide that wasn't actually happening. And that's why there was a filing by Ukraine to the ICJ. And the ICJ issued provisional measures, which Russia said, well, so what? Because Russia is on the Security Council and has a veto power. But yes, so Russia was using that. And that's part of why the Genocide Convention is such a problematic convention, because it actually hypothetically gives you the right to intervene in the business of another country if there is genocide there, which flies in the face of the general norm of international relations, certainly after World War II. So yes, on boycotts, look, I mean, for a long time, I thought that the general boycott on Israel was not a great idea because it would have been mostly against intellectuals, universities. And I thought for a long time, look, I mean, the only place where in Israel there's still sort of opposition to Israeli policies and people pushing in another direction was there. So I thought it was not a good idea, I have to say. But I did think that the supply, the constant supply of arms, which has to do not only with support for Israel, of course, it has to do with money interests, it has to do with trying out arms and showing how well they operate. You have to understand that the international market for arms sales now is going through the roof. Everybody's making people buy yachts all over the place from all the money that they're making on selling these deadly weapons. So I thought that the profligate supply of arms could certainly have been used much more in terms of controlling Israeli policy. Since October 7th, my views have been changing because Israeli universities, certainly some of them, have behaved so abysmally and have started towing the line so badly, especially vis-a-vis the Palestinian faculty. And there are Palestinian faculty members in Israeli universities, far fewer than should be, but there are some. One professor eventually retired from Tel Aviv University, Nadir Shalhub Kevorkian, under pressure from the university and then arrested by the police, and the university never coming out in her support. The university administration, the president and the provost have behaved absolutely abysmally. The same happened at Beersheba University. I was subjected to that myself when I came to talk there and could not give a talk there. And the university did nothing about it. And so although there are individual members, individual Israeli academics who are very brave and totally admirable and do things that I don't know if I would go to the West Bank and try to protect the Palestinians there from settlers. The universities as organizations have told the nationalist patriotic line in ways that I think are shameful, and that they will maybe, hopefully in the future, pay a price for that. So I myself have boycotted Hebrew University and Ben Gurion University and informed them that I would not go there as long as they're under their current leadership. So I think by now, I have no problem with individuals saying that they would not cooperate with these institutions. I think that in terms of inviting Israeli academics, one should look at what they say and what they do and decide on the basis of that, not on the basis of their identity, which is always problematic. But I've moved quite a ways from where I was on October 7th because of the deeply disappointing attitude of so many academics in Israel, including, I have to say, people who write and research the Holocaust, and to whom I have appealed, asking them to say something about what is happening in Gaza. If they say, and people speak so much about why there was silence during the Holocaust, and I said, it is time for you now to speak up. I wrote that already in November last year, and I've only been met by silence or derision from those people. So I find it quite sad, really.